welcome to Talk. Today's Talk Roundtable is going to be about, we're going to discuss the standard for background checks. So that's a really cool topic, and we've got some great guest speakers with us who know a lot more about this subject than I do. So I'm very excited to have them. So we'll introduce them in a second. But while everybody's still coming on here, let me share my screen and discuss Talk. So Talk is an organization that was intending to elevate and promote the TA function across the globe. So we are more than just, today's event. If you're new and you just saw this event, definitely check around on the platform. You sign in. You'll notice that, your homepage is going to be a news feed of all the, interesting topics in the forum, some polls that are being posted, some upcoming events that we have. Obviously, if you're here for the event, you know that we have events, but we do have events basically every week online. And we also have events all the time in your local city. We have 80 chapters around North America. And, there's, whether it's, networking events and happy hours, or whether it's, working sessions, there's events going on all the time. And hopefully as spring and summer come around, that'll even pick up a little bit more. So always check back and take a look to see what's going on around the country. We have a great forum that's got, comments coming in all the time. So definitely, if you have a question, we have over 10,000 members. Put the question out to the membership. And even if you don't have a question, take a look at other people's questions, pay it forward, answer some questions. And, when you need some information, the community will also be there for you. We do have an awesome polling system, and you can, again, put this out. You can put this out just to specific people if you want to do just your industry or region or everyone, and, get some great data. This is a great way to benchmark things, see what your peers in talent acquisition are doing across North America. We do have a member directory, so you can come in here and find, you can filter this down by location, by the industry, how big their company is, and you can find some people that have very similar challenges to you, and you can connect with them on LinkedIn, although you can also just chat with them right here on Talk. Connect with them, see what they're doing. You can definitely learn from each other. And then we have a couple of our newer features, vendor directory and an agency directory. So these are resources for our community. I want to be clear that at this point, the vendors and the agencies, they're not actual members. So you won't find them on these events. You won't find them in the forums or interacting, but this is a great resource for you to go out and again, see what your peers are saying about, certain solutions. Come in here, see what the reviews are like on Greenhouse. If you're looking for an ATS, if you're looking for a new agency in an area that you haven't hired, whether it's, here or abroad, and, different functional roles and things that your team doesn't have experience in, you can check through this directory. We have over 3,000 agencies, I believe, and we really just started this a few months ago. So the goal is in a few years, to have basically every agency in America. So, you could also tell your agencies about this, and they can sign up, and, you can rate and review them, and you can see the reviews from your peers. So, okay, all that being said, it looks like we've got pretty much everyone signed in. I am going to, let's pull this out here. Let's get back to the subject at hand. And that is today's standard for background checks. And we have two amazing guest hosts. We have Darin Eydenberg and Noelle Harling. Darin Eydenberg from KangarooStar, Noelle Harling from Frasco Profiles. I'm going to let them give their own intros and tell you a little bit about their backgrounds and how it relates to background checks and what their companies do. And so let me kick it over to you guys now.
Great. Thanks so much, Norm. Hi, everyone. So I'm Darin Eydenberg. I'm CEO of KangarooStar, which is a tech-enabled job matching platform. KangarooStar Post is really think TikTok meets Tinder for jobs, using web-enabled job matching for this next generation of talent. And I'm joined by such a good friend, Noelle Harling, who is such a leader in her space of background checks. I would say values checks. I'm going to let her introduce herself in a moment, but I just wanted to let you know that our friendship really formed and during COVID, as we were kind of reimagining what the world of values checks would look like in this very quickly changing world of remote work, right? And so that's a little bit of the origin, the catalyst for this conversation as we existed in COVID together and then are looking at the world, the changed world and the continuously changing world, and how we recruit and retain professionals and really make sure that we get the professionals that we think we're getting, especially when they're at least part of the time remote. So with that, Noelle, I'll hand it to you for an introduction and then we'll get started.
Sounds good. Thanks, Darin. Welcome, everyone. Noelle Harling. As Darin mentioned, I'm an SVP with Frasco Profiles. I've been in background screening for, I don't want to say, I'm not really that old. I started when I was 9 or something like that, but I've been doing it about 30 years. I am on the board of directors of the Professional Background Screening Association, which is our industry trade association. We are a founding member of the association from 2003, and I've been doing background checks for a very long time and talk to a lot of recruiters, HR, talent acquisition people every single day. So excited to be here and really looking forward to chatting a little bit about what's going on in 2023. Also, Darin, really quickly, you call them values checks, and I've never heard anyone refer to background checks as values checks, but I think that's a great way to look at it. And I think we're going to dig into that a little bit and what that actually means today. So looking forward to it.
Fantastic. And just for everyone, my background was in private equity. I was an investor for many years. And then I spent 15 years at Korn Ferry, where we exclusively worked with Frasco and relied on them for all of our executive checks. So I'm just bringing that up. I think that as we set the playing field for this conversation, I think we want to start off with just understanding what are the most prominent background checks that the leading companies use. So this is just to level set, and then we'll go from how they're changing. But Noelle, do you mind sharing with the group what the standards are for just the background checks that are used across the top leading companies today?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I think no surprise, criminal checks, criminal background is going to be your number one option. People are looking to reduce risk, prevent liability. So criminal background checks are big. Employment, validating prior employment and experience is pretty big. We do a lot of education verification, and then you go into your industry sector. So driving history in transportation, or for organizations that have drivers in course and scope, or we'll go into healthcare, we'll go into sanction screening, or any of the federally regulated industries that have some specific requirements for screening other items. We've also added a lot of social media screening in the last couple of years as well, especially as the pandemic continued beyond the first 2 or 3 weeks, which is we all expected it to be done, and get back to normal. But we're
going to talk about social media, very specifically in a few minutes. But I think it's important to highlight that it really still is that criminal education checks, right? And then obviously drug screening, et cetera. But when we think about today and what's different, let's talk about what's new and different in the last few years related to the pandemic or just demographically shifting. What are the things that you see most dramatically shifting?
Yeah, I think drug testing clearly is up from pre-pandemic. A lot more employers have added drug testing with their remote workforce and their hybrid workforce. So we are seeing a lot more clinical services in that way. In terms of what's trending, again, more social media since the pandemic and the remote hybrid workforce. I think the really big one, kind of the one that caught me by surprise maybe a year ago that's really trending, is employee monitoring. And as employers are making that determination not to return to in-person workforce, they're starting to monitor their employees' behavior. So they're doing criminal monitoring, driver monitoring. Like I said, if they have drivers in course and scope, they're monitoring their driving records. In those regulated industries like healthcare, they're doing the OIG monitoring, Medicare, Medicaid requirements, so those sanctions and exclusions. But the newest product on the block really, and it's not quite market ready, but it's very close, is employment monitoring, where employers can monitor certain segments of their employee population through payroll records to see if there's concurrent employment. Maybe they're working for you and you're paying them, full salary, but they're also moonlighting for a competitor or another organization that's impacting their productivity. So they're looking at employment monitoring through payroll records to see if there's a risk there with their current workforce.
Well, let's pause there because I think these are big ones, right? So obviously during the pandemic, we saw an increase in drug use, right? And employers are reacting very quickly to that and doing, I would say not only drug testing upon onboarding, but also continuous drug testing. So I think let's pause on this topic of drug testing. Even as marijuana is legalized in many states, right? Some of the testing is opting out of testing for marijuana, but then there are other categories and even, frankly, prescription drug medications that are being looked for. Is anyone seeing that in their arena? Has that become a part of your scope, or that wasn't there before and now is in a post-pandemic environment?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of our clients are removing marijuana from their drug testing panels. They're just, especially if they have a national presence, and they're really concerned about, is it legal in this jurisdiction or is it not legal in this jurisdiction, where pre-employment drug testing might not be legal in New York, New Jersey, Nevada, but it's legal in most states. And if you're hiring remote employees in some of those states where it's not legal, you can really slip up and put yourself at risk for litigation, right? So we're seeing a lot of clients remove marijuana. I want to be clear, it's still an illegal drug under federal regulation. So if you're a federally regulated employer, you have to test for it. If you're involved in a workplace, drug-free workplace policy or program where you're getting benefits for having a drug-free workplace, you cannot remove marijuana from your panel. But yeah, we are seeing a trend toward removing marijuana, but we are also seeing a trend toward more drug screening overall for pre-employment.
And the other big one, and we talked about this when we talked about hiring the next generation, Gen Z. 77% of Gen Z professionals have multiple jobs. And then you look at some of the more seasoned professionals who have been working in roles and then have moonlighted or tried something new there, or had a side hustle, as they say. This is becoming more a concern for productivity for employers. And so they want to make sure that their employees are in fact working for only them. And I think we'll see this increase for sure. So I don't know if this is a topic that's come up in any of your places of employment, but is this a category or a topic that's come up with your executive teams?
Specifically about THC?
Yes.
Yes, very much so. And making that decision for all of the reasons we all talked about. And honestly, it's becoming a central point of an early conversation with a candidate that can derail relationship building. We're wanting to let folks know that that's part of our process, and that can, that becomes a different kind of conversation than you want to be having.
And if you had to apply like a percentage to when that derails a conversation, like, so you bring it up and you present the process that you're going to ask a candidate to go through. Mm-hmm. How often is that derailing a conversation?
I don't have a hard percentage. I'd say it's more common in our early career roles, that it will either create a more detailed conversation than you want to have, or a candidate will drop out of the process and we won't hear from them at that point. So
right. And certainly, as I'm seeing on the chat, like in certain industries, it is normal to have multiple jobs or be a consultant. But I think that in certain cases we're expecting 40+ hour weeks. This is where we're seeing the real issue on having multiple jobs. So these two things are really top of mind, and we talk about them quite a bit for sure. And I'm sitting here in Colorado, which frankly, I'd say like we had mushrooms legalized. And I'd say like 6 months ago, if you were to ask an audience of people in Colorado if they thought that they were legal, I would say 50% of the people would say that they were legal already. So you have this very confusing, I think many people are very confused on drug stance, and it is up to us as recruiters and hiring managers to really clarify the rules for people, because they can often be very surprised when they walk into a job situation to learn the rules of the game.
Just want to jump in there, Darin, just to mention mushrooms. So psilocybin is not going to get picked up in a drug test. I just want to say that. So if you're thinking you're going to pick up use of mushrooms in a pre-employment drug test, it is not going to show up.
I had no idea.
You're not part of the panel. Yep.
That's really fascinating. Okay,
Yeah.
well, there you go. So as we move on, I think we want to spend some time talking about social media. This is one where I was working with Frasco years ago. I was surprised to suddenly see the reports, the more fulsome reports that I received from Frasco, detailing an executive candidate's background with respect to like what's on social media, but then also to have our junior professionals within Korn Ferry do quick searches on Facebook or on Google and find really alarming things. Sadly, in certain cases, 15 years, 10 years prior, but the kind of information that sticks with professionals today and showcases, frankly, even their like early 20s and the kind of person, the values they had, really quite shocking and alarming. Or on the other side, as an executive, when Glassdoor or other sites where they're kind of free and open to allowing employees to comment on their executives' performance, we've had full reports really destroying executive level candidates in their performance as a leader. And so I'm going to pass it to you, Noelle, to just share what's being done today, how robust it is and thorough, and what are employers doing on their own that might be separate from Frasco.
It's a great question. Social media screening is it's tricky, right? If you're doing it through a background screening company, they're going to give you a report back that's FCRA compliant because you may take adverse action based on the results. So in social media, when you're running social media through a background screening company, you can do anything from a basic social media check, which is going to be maybe a 3 to 5 year check, hitting the main platforms like Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, right? Or you can do a really robust deep dive social media where you can set the parameters as to what you're looking for. So in a basic screen, you're going to basically just get negative posts flagged for things like violence, drug use, misogynistic tendencies, bias, bullying, things like that that are going to be really negative in your workforce. But if you get into a more robust social media search where you can set your parameters for what you're looking for, you're going to get an entire web crawl, including all of the social media platforms, but also just a basic sort of news, periodicals, everything on that person is going to come back. And where we see some really interesting things going on is when the employer is in an industry where hiring somebody who is secretly trying to infiltrate the organization to take the employer down. Let me give you an example, it'll make more sense. Say you're in a laboratory and you do animal testing, and you have somebody who's an animal rights activist applying for a job to get into lab to take photos and video of what you're actually doing. You're going to see that on social media. You're going to see on social media that they're an animal rights activist, right? And so in that instance, and this is kind of an extreme example, but there's a lot more nuance to it for less extreme examples where you can see that and you can prevent that from happening, saving brands, saving reputation, saving a lot of money in trying to remedy the problems you have from bringing that person in. So social media is kind of all, you can carve it as tightly or as loosely as you want. The employers that are doing social media searches themselves, it's a lot trickier because they may be making employment decisions based on information that they're not legally allowed to use. And so most general employment attorneys would advise clients not to do it yourself and to have a third party do it where they can screen it for, legal use. But there is.
What is the difference? I think that's an important point and one that's coming up in our chat. What is the difference between making a hiring decision based on social media that an employer finds versus a background check company finds?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of things on social. Look, I have kids in their 20s, so I see their social media. There's a lot of things, especially the younger hires that are coming into the workforce. There's a lot of things they'll post on social media without thinking much about it. And you may see things about them on social media that you don't like, but they may not be things that legally you could use to not hire them. You may see a lot of things that could lead down the road, if you denied employment based on things you see, could lead down the road to litigation toward disparate impact. For instance, if they're minorities and you see that you're ruling out a larger number of minorities based on their social media posts, then those types of things can occur if you're not super careful about how you use social media when you're running it yourself.
What if you find articles on someone being either being given a DUI? Oh, you can find that another way, but or like they were kicked out in college from a hazing ritual or something like that was very dangerous. And that was years ago, but you found this through a Google check or something of that nature, and it wouldn't have come up otherwise. It was in articles in some paper. Are you able to make a decision on values based on that? Or is there a time frame that limits use of information?
So I have to be careful. I'm not an attorney and I can't give legal advice. Everything we're saying here should not be construed as legal advice. But I think you have to go back to the EEOC's, they put out a document years ago and then they updated it about the legal use of criminal history and employment decisions. And although it was written specifically for how to use criminal information, you can extend that to a broader interpretation to say all information if you want to make sure you're not going to run afoul of the EEOC. Right. So the typical questions you have to ask are, how long ago did the event occur? What was the severity of the event? And is the event related to the position sought or held? Right. So a hazing event that happened 10 or 12 years ago in college, and the person's applying for, an IT position. Is that related? Is the time since that happened long enough that that person's grown up, matured? So you kind of have to look at it as a three-pronged question when looking at that type of information before you make a decision about using it to deny employment. Right.
So basically, I think we're concluding that running social media checks internally can be challenging, but hiring a Frasco, for example, or another background check company to do it in a legal way, that is probably the appropriate course of action. There was a question in the chat. What are FCRA obligations in running social media checks or reference checking in-house versus through a third-party service, which I think is a good follow-up question.
Yeah, so it's tricky because it's jurisdictionally controlled. So FCRA is Fair Credit Reporting Act. That's federal law, and the overarching umbrella federal law says you're not allowed to use adverse public information beyond 7 years, except for criminal convictions. Whether social media is going to be considered adverse public information, I don't think there's case law on that yet. So I would be concerned about being that first case, right? You don't want your company to be the guinea pig for what a judge and jury are going to do with that. If you're in certain states like California, California has its own sort of version of the FCRA. And in that it says, if as an employer, you're going to do checks not through a consumer reporting agency, which is a background check, then you have to give your applicants the option to opt out of receiving a copy of everything you pull on them. It's not an opt-in. If you're doing it, it's an opt-out. And if you don't have the document saying, yes, I opt out of receiving, you're obligated to give them everything you looked at during the hiring decision. California is unique. They're the only state that has that obligation. So it really kind of depends on where you are.
That's very helpful. I have another question on social media checks. Have you seen language play a factor in social media checks, i.e. the ability to check social posts that are not in English?
Definitely. And the other sort of piggyback question to that is, what is the scope of social media? And I would say predominantly the scope of social media is US. So if you're looking at social media for an applicant that resides outside of the US, you're probably not going to see much of their social media. So in terms of language, there isn't a lot of translation available for social media, so it's a little bit more difficult to catch negative or derogatory things that are in another language. It really depends on the language. I mean, in the United States, there are hundreds and hundreds of languages spoken. So I don't know that I could give you a very pointed answer on that. I would just say you're less likely to have success with social media if your applicants are posting in a language other than English.
Okay, great. And so before we're about to move on from social media. So I think we'd love to understand the timing, like how the time frame has changed. And this is something that we really want to put out to the group, because I think, like everything during COVID, there have been slowdowns, right? Slowdowns in any kind of logistics chains, including within for background checks, unfortunately. But maybe you can talk a little bit about the time frame for these various checks, and then we can gauge with the group how time frame has played or has had an impact on whether you wish to use or not to use background checks when you're hiring.
Yeah, that's a great question also. Turnaround time during COVID definitely expanded significantly, depending on what you were running. A lot of courts closed and sent their clerks home during the beginning of COVID, and the courts were just closed and there was nobody to do research. A lot of schools closed and sent their employees off campus, especially, they sent students home and they went virtual, but the registrar's offices also sent the registrars home, right? The administrative offices sent the administrators home. And so doing education checks, if it wasn't a record that was available through the National Student Clearinghouse, a college degree, especially in high school GEDs, those types of things, the turn time became really extended because the registrars just weren't there. They were working remotely. They were going into the schools maybe once a month. So you were seeing really long turn times. We've come out of that. Everybody's back to work in these positions where we need them to be for original source information. I will say, turn times have kind of come back to normal. And I do hear and I empathize with employers who are saying, oh my God, background checks are taking so long, the criminal checks are taking so long. What I would say is, on a national average, we're seeing criminal check turn times around 24 to 48 hours. However, there are some very significant hotspots where it's just blown out of the water. The entire state of Georgia, 15 to 30 days on turn time on criminal background checks. California, I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of litigation against the courts in California. So the courts made this sort of decision and the legislators backed them on removing public access to PII. So if I'm running a background check on John Smith, I may get 100 cases and I don't have a date of birth to validate them. So I then have to put a request in with the court clerk to go pull the file and validate those and give me back the cases that match. Some courts have enough staff to be able to do it, some don't. I'm seeing in Sacramento 90-day turn times on criminal record research, 90 days in Sacramento, California, our state's capital.
Oh my gosh.
So it's kind of all over the place. But in general, 80 to 85% of background checks, criminal background checks, are turning in under 48 hours. 15% are anywhere from 72 hours to Sacramento, which I just think everybody wants to bang their head against a wall.
Oh, I can only imagine.
Yeah.
Well, in this audience, how has the time frame for a background check influenced your desire to use background checks? Or frankly, does everyone use background checks for every employee? Yeah.
And don't be afraid to shout it out. You can put it in the chat, but definitely you're all able to open up your mic if you want to talk.
And you get them back within 2 days. Okay, I'm seeing a typical 2 days. That's great.
Yeah, we definitely use them for all of our employees, but we don't. The turnaround time is in some ways irrelevant because we have to, right? We have to have the background check, so we can't. That's not really a determining factor. What I think the bigger determining factor is finding that vendor, that partner that can support us in faster turnaround times and get us what we need sooner rather than later. So that's kind of our main driver.
Right. And I see I'm getting some feedback that in certain cases, they've had employees start contingent on the background check, and their continuation of employment is dependent on the background check. And we're seeing delays in California. So as I'm looking at this chat, so very consistent feedback. I am interested if you have expanded your suite of background check requirements as a result of having more remote workers, or if there's been anxiety as you've gone to, I'm sure some percentage of this group here has a hybrid work arrangement with employees, or frankly, even remote. And have there been many conversations on how to change the kind of check or what to do as a protocol around a more remote workforce? I'd love to hear some ideas or some sharings with the group.
Social media is one that we're adding that we traditionally only did at the executive level. So that's something new. Very interesting about the payroll monitoring. I have not heard of that. So that may be something we're interested in, because we've been seeing that be an issue for us as well.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing.
A lot of healthcare. I'm seeing a lot of chat from healthcare people, and yeah, especially Oscar, the travel nurses. Oh my gosh, because they're all over, right? You can have a travel nurse have, 15 different criminal searches because they move every 4, 6, 9 months or a year, depending on their contracts. And so the more jurisdictions you're searching, the more percentage, the odds are that you're going to hit, they're going to have been in one of those jurisdictions that's just really running slow right now. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So we're about to move on to really a big new topic.
Okay, quick down before we move on,
yeah.
especially if we're going to jump into a big one. Maybe I can just give a 60-second word from our sponsors, so I don't interrupt in the middle of a hot discussion. So let me quickly share my screen. Okay, so we all know that everybody wants better talent, faster, cheaper, and with less effort. Now that's very easy to say and almost impossible to do, but Recruitify can provide that. Recruitify provides a vendor management system for both full-time direct hires as well as contingent and temp hires. And how do they save your company? By consolidating vendors, not only your existing vendors, but also a community of over 20,000 agencies around the globe into a single system, a single payee, a single communication channel, streamlining the entire process. It allows you to gain control and visibility in a line of hiring where a lot of these things will go through the individual budgets of individual departments, and Recruitify will allow you to actually gain control and visibility into your full company-wide spend. It allows you to outsource some of the more difficult roles. I think if you probably look at your own talent acquisition organization, you're probably spending about 80% of your time on about 20% of the hires. If you can, outsource even, 2-5% of those from the beginning and not be spending all of that time up front, it allows you to do more with less on your existing team and allow you to focus on the roles that you can, fill in a more efficient way. And that allows you to optimize your entire TA organization. Don't trust me? Go to reviews on G2, overwhelmingly positive. And one other thing I will say is that you can also check reviews on Talk Talent. So go to the vendor directory and check out the reviews on Recruitify. Again, also overwhelmingly favorable. And just one more plug for Talk is go in there and review all of your vendors, not just Recruitify, because that'll help everyone get good visibility into what vendors you're using and how they stack up. So I will stop and hand it back over to you, Darin. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thanks for that message. Okay, so we're on the topic of I-9s. And before I say more, I'm just going to pass it to Noelle to introduce the topic, but I suspect it's one that you're all thinking about. So Noelle.
Yeah, definitely. So when we went basically overnight to a remote workforce, everyone was in the position of how do I validate identity documents when the employee is not coming into the office anymore? And so E-Verify and USCIS came up with an extension, right? So they extended the timeline and said, you can onboard without viewing the identity documents. You can use this extension. And it was a 3-month extension. It got extended. It got extended. It got extended. They keep saying we're ending the extension. We're ending the extension. We're still in an extension period. But what they did in the interim is they allowed the use of a designated agent to view and certify the identity documents. And anybody who's using this, please shout out either shout out or put it in the chat. But one of the things that we do at Frasco is we have an electronic I-9 process where you send an invitation to the employee to fill out section 1. Then the employee can designate somebody to view their identity documents and do section 2 certifications on behalf of the employer. They can choose a spouse, they can choose a roommate, they can choose a neighbor. They have to be, I think, over 18 or over 21, I don't remember. But then they put that email of that person in, the invitation for section 2 goes to that person. They have to go and sit with that person, show them their identity documents. That person has to enter the identity documents into section 2 the way you would as an employer. And they certify. There's a pop-up that says, you know, you can go to jail for fraud if you are lying, basically. It's kind of scary. They certify, and then it finishes the I-9, and you get the notice that the I-9 is completed. You can review it. And then if you want to, you can kick off the E-Verify from there if you're required to do E-Verify. So, you know, it seems like a lot of employers don't know that this was made available and it's legal. So I just wanted to throw that out there, because if you still have employees in a remote workforce or a hybrid workforce, it's something that, I mean, we're not the only one that offers it. Other background companies offer it too. So you might want to check with your vendor to see if that's an option if you're struggling with that. I think you're muted, Darin.
I think it's an interesting topic, as we talked about, and Noelle and I were talking about the trucking space, right? And where you're constantly hiring or contracting with many professionals. We're talking about it, and as it relates to healthcare, home health aides, right? Where there's such a high volume of hiring or contracting. So we're curious as to the use of this, or if anyone's experimented or started using this process, and how easy it's been for the potential or the job seekers or the potential professionals being hired to do and implement using their own or having access to technology, et cetera. Anyone have experience? I know there were a few of you who were nodding your head. Do you use this? No? Okay.
I'm using it at Allianz. We just kicked it off. One thing so we're using the notary service though, where the associate or the new hire will go in and put in their zip code and then find a notary that's located close to them.
Right.
It's quite pricey, I will say, but our attorney told us that if we did use the situation where we had vendors, I'm sorry, where the new hire actually chose someone to verify their I-9, that as the employer, we would still be held, like ultimately we could allow it, but if something went wrong, it would still fall on us. So that was the guidance we got, but we'd prefer to use, of course, the associate selected person, just for ease, because, you know, the notary, if it's a small town, the notary may be, I don't know, 20-minute drive or 30-minute drive. So it's something we're weighing right now, but we're using the notary service for now.
Okay.
Yeah, I would always defer to counsel, but it is, I mean, if you look at the website, the USCIS website, it's very clearly allowed and legal. There was a question I don't want to miss. There was a question. Do you mind if we skip around a little bit, Darin?
No.
There was
Not
a
at
really
all.
good question about THC and drug-free workplace programs.
Yes.
So the benefits that I'm aware of for participating in a federal drug-free workplace program are generally, depending on your location, you may get a discount on your work comp premiums, and in some cases it can be a significant discount. So that's something that when I talk about a benefit of being engaged or involved in a drug-free workplace program, the federal government has outline of what that program has to be, and you have to follow certain protocols to qualify before your work comp carrier would give you a discount on your premiums. It's not in every state. It's not in California. I'm in California. That doesn't work in California, but they do offer it in some states. And so I think that's a benefit. I mean, work comp premiums are, huge. And so that's why I see some of our clients participating in those programs. In terms of who's required to screen for THC still, federal government employees, federal contractors to the federal government, subcontractors to those contractors to the federal government. So it's in the supply chain to the federal government because it is a federal law.
Right.
Yeah, I hope that answered the question. The other question about I-9s, there really is no other legal way. You either have them come in and you do the validation of the identity documents sitting across a desk and looking at them, or you can utilize the third-party agent. And whether you do use a notary, which is acceptable, or you allow the employee to designate their agent, somebody still has to visually inspect those documents. They don't allow you to hold them up on a Zoom meeting and look at the face and look at the documents. That's not a legal use. If you're a large organization, the costs of notary are, the person who mentioned it, it is quite expensive. I've seen it anywhere from $25 or $30 up to $100 per I-9 to use a notary. So,
yeah, absolutely. So I think what would be helpful is if we could share some I-9 information. Does Frasco produce something that could give more detail into that process?
You mean like a sell sheet or something like that, or just do you want me to talk
something
about
that
it
just
more?
describes it? Yeah. So this group could think about that use as part of their programming. I think there is a desire for some more information. So maybe we can send something out, Norm, to this group. And then separately, I was just thinking about this, like going back to education checks, which I think we all use. Is it, and I think you had said to me, Noelle, that education checks are where you see the most like red flags, or I should say like inconsistencies. And this group probably shares that feeling. But I do wonder in a COVID or post-COVID landscape, if we'll see more inconsistencies, right? Given the upheaval or so many people taking years off or things of that nature. Have you seen an increase in discrepancies in the last few years, or is it too early to tell?
No, I haven't really seen an increase in a discrepancy. It's the number one thing in a background check that people lie about are degrees, diplomas, GEDs. It's the number one thing where they assert they have a degree and they don't. And so you get into, managing disputes and ultimately having to go back to them and go back to the employer and say they don't have a degree. And I would say, more than anything else in the background check, that's the number one thing people lie about. And they lie because they think it's a requirement of the job. And they think if they're honest, they won't get the job. And so many times I've had employers come back to me and say, we couldn't move forward because they lied. And what's really a shame is it wasn't a requirement for the position. Right. And that's heartbreaking. talent acquisition is hard enough as it is. You get that person, you've invested the time, the resources, the financial resources, you have your candidate, and it comes down to they falsified their application and you can't move forward, and it just wasn't required. I would say I do see in certain areas, certain jurisdictions, and also in entry-level positions, employers removing education from the background check just because it's hard. It's hard to find the talent they're looking for in a competitive market. And also people are moving away from seeing a high school diploma, a GED, or even a bachelor's degree as a requirement for being successful in the job. Certainly, a bachelor's degree shows somebody had the stick-to-itiveness, the grit, the tenacity to get all the way through college, right? So you think that's going to demonstrate character, in your hire. But if the position doesn't require it, somebody has an art degree and they're applying for a position in a manufacturing warehouse, so we're seeing employers consider dropping education in some positions. Yeah, your experience equivalencies we're seeing. Yeah.
Great. This is her, and I'm reading the chat because it's also very interesting. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, there was a law passed in California, and I'm sorry, I keep mentioning California. It's just California. Where goes California goes the rest of the country in background screening. California and New York are first, and the rest of the country catches up eventually. And we had a law passed in California a few years ago that said you cannot require education if it's not relevant to the position. You can't deny employment based on it. So we saw a lot of California employers dropping the requirement for a high school diploma or a GED for entry-level positions.
It's fascinating. Yeah, I'm looking at this. It seems like we do have a significant group from California with employees in California here who are hearing you really well.
Yeah.
Well, so on that topic, do you see companies who have significant numbers of employees in California, do they just go in the direction and treat all of their employees, job seekers, the same across the country?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think it aligns more with industry sector than geographic location. We'll see manufacturers in California, Chicagoland, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. They'll all kind of follow a similar pattern. It's not that all employers in California are doing one thing and it's different in other states. Trends tend to follow, industry sectors.
Right. Okay.
I think that was your question.
That was. Thank you.
Yeah.
Now, are there any questions or any topics that have not been covered yet? Because we have a few minutes left. And we just want to make sure that we use this time wisely. I know a lot has changed. So just in my experience, one thing I'd like to ask this group, my experience when I was at Korn Ferry, we automatically, as a large search firm, we automatically, in part to protect ourselves, did background checks, and it was a mandatory aspect of our company, right? And we did background checks specifically as it relates to education, as it was the first, as Noelle had said, it's probably the biggest category with red flags, right? And then we would probe more completely, and certainly the employers would have their own desired collection of background checks that they would do more full in a more fulsome way. But is it helpful to you? Do you mandate, or do you prefer your partners, when you work with partners, to do the background checks in advance of seeing candidates or concurrently with the process? And I know Noelle's going to say you have to do it when you're giving an offer or intent to give an offer, but things like education checks, so many firms do them as a starter with the kind of the slate of candidates. And then yearly, okay. Only after offer, right, which is the rule. But education checks you can do earlier. Is that correct?
Depends on where you're located. Anybody in New York?
PowerPoint?
Some states, some counties, some cities have Fairchance law that says you can't do anything until you make an offer. Some say you can't do anything until you have an accepted offer. Some say you can't do any background check, accepted offer is really the baseline. But if you're in New York City, anybody in New York City, oh my goodness, I feel for you. The Commission on Human Rights in New York City is intense. They have a bifurcated process where you have to run everything except the criminally related information pre-offer, review that, then make an offer, then you can run the criminal search. You cannot run the criminal before the offer. You can't run the employment, education, reference checking, OIG, whatever you run. You can't run that after the offer. You have to run all of that.
Oh my goodness.
It's very, very complex. If anyone's in New York City and you want help managing that, contact Norm. He can give you my contact information, or look me up. I'll help you with that, because New York City is crazy. Not New York State, New York City. And there was one other question. I think we're close to time on the FACES checks. It seems like there's a lot of healthcare people in here. So FACES checks, it's the healthcare sanction screening that's required by OIG. They require you cannot have an employee or a vendor. So you got to be checking your vendors too, or subcontractors that appear excluded to work in an environment that gets Medicare or Medicaid funding, depending on your state. So the FACES is divided into 3 levels. 100% of our clients run a FACES 3. And the reason that is, and FACES 3 includes the federal exclusion list, but also all of the state Medicaid exclusion lists. And the reason a FACES running it at a level 3 is important is because if somebody is not on the OIG exclusion list, but they're over on the New Jersey Medicaid exclusion list, you're responsible for knowing that. And if you're not running a level 3, you're not getting that. And it takes time for the state who funnels the information to the federal OIG list. It's the list of excluded individuals and entities, the LEIE. It takes time for the state to process the complaint and go through the entire process, determine that they're going to exclude them. Then they send that information to the OIG. Sometimes there's a significant delay before it gets to the OIG. So we recommend always running a level 3. Most of our clients in healthcare are also monitoring monthly. So not only are they doing a pre-hire, they just put that employee on a monitoring check, and every 28 days, the search is run again, automated, just to make sure that they didn't miss something, that comes up from something they did a long time ago, that maybe there was a pause, there was an investigation going on, but the sanction hadn't been issued yet. Because sometimes, for those of you in healthcare, the healthcare things have to be filed with the board has to investigate. Sometimes it can take a year or 2 to get through that process before they find a final exclusion. So you really should be monitoring too. So level 3 would be my recommendation always.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And we did have a quick question on probation as revealed in, maybe you can talk about criminal checks a little bit and what we see versus what we don't see.
Sure. Again, it's jurisdictional, but the industry standard for all background screening companies, the go-to industry standard is a 7-year criminal history check, reporting criminal information for 7 years from the date of disposition, release, or parole. So disposition is the date the case was adjudicated, the date the court pronounced them guilty. Release is the date they were released from custody. So if it was a misdemeanor and they did county jail, the release date is the day they walk out of county jail. In most cases, they're going to be put on probation, but that is the probationary period is not used as a clock starter for that 7-year. The last piece of it is parole, though. So if they have a conviction 10 years ago, right, which would be your disposition date, but they did state prison, because it was a felony, and they were paroled, meaning they were released from custody within 7 years, that parole date is what you go by. So you would then report maybe a 10-year-old felony because they were paroled within 7. I know that's a lot of math, and I apologize, I'm speaking very quickly. In terms of probation, certain states don't even allow you to look at probation as a determining factor. It's only disposition, release, or parole. And under federal law, a background screening company can report non-conviction information up to 7 years, but conviction data forever. However, certain states, and there are several of them, have law that supersedes the FCRA that says, nope, background companies, you can only report 7 years of non-conviction or conviction data. So that's why the industry standard is 7 years. So if you have facilities in multiple states, you have a consistent hiring process, and you're looking at a 7-year history for all hires.
And again, that's the location of the hiring physician or the location where the person was in jail, just to be clear.
So where they're incarcerated is irrelevant. People will move around and get transferred to be closer to family or whatever. It turns on two things: where they live and where the job is located. And every state, city, or county law that supersedes the FCRA has a different criteria. So you have to know the criteria. So it may be where they live, it may be where the job is located. Yeah, it depends. That's why everyone generally, unless you're required, obligated to do more, every background company offers a 7-year search, because we don't want to run afoul of what we are allowed to report legally.
Noelle, I'm surprised you don't have a legal background given the, the complexity of this, right?
It's complicated,
right?
Yeah. Yeah, I've been doing it for a long time, and you learn, you know, I've grown up in this industry, so I've sort of absorbed it all, you know.
Well, thank you so much for being on today. And thank you everyone who's joined and participated in this conversation. I'll pass it to Norm, but Norm, please do feel free to pass on contact details as folks have additional questions.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you so much for being on. I've actually been really excited about this. I am a New York native, so watching the George Santos thing play out locally has been amazing. It's probably the best advertising ever for the background check industry. As you're
Absolutely.
saying, you know, you can fabricate one thing in your educational background and lose your role, even if it's not you know, required. And here we have people in our government who have made up their education, their work history, their charitable, you know, history. And so I'm going to get you in touch with Congress, and I think you can do a world of good over there. And so you did not disappoint. This was a really, you know, interesting conversation. I want to thank both Noelle and Darin. And yes, I will definitely hand out in the follow-up. I'll make sure that people can get in touch with both of you if you have more questions. And yeah, thanks for everyone for participating. And we'll see you again next week.
Thanks, everyone. It was great.
Take care.
Thank you.